Okay, and for today's presentation, it's going to go along with the Chapter 2 and Chapter 4 notes of biochemistry. Today, we'll be reviewing 7th grade life science, 8th grade life science and chemistry, 9th grade biology, and 10th grade chemistry. These are the fundamentals of AP biology. So we're going to go ahead and start off our presentation with the question of how does carbon monoxide gas affect the body? And as you can see, it's not very good. So looking at this diagram, what we see is a red blood cell. Red blood cells have a protein called hemoglobin, and on the red blood cells, they carry oxygen around the body. This is possible because iron and hemoglobin binds to oxygen inside the air. But if there's carbon monoxide in the air, it ends up binding to iron more tightly and basically kicks off oxygen and carbon dioxide. So if carbon monoxide poisoning is not treated quickly, it can cause fatal suffocation. So that's a little bit scary. So let's talk about, first of all, what are the elements that are essential to life? When you guys were 7th graders and 9th graders, we talked about chon, which was carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. And they still are the ones that make up 96% of living matter. Most of the remaining 4% is phosphorus, calcium, potassium, and sulfur. Trace amounts of these are actually required by organisms, but in very small and minute quantities. So let's talk about electrons when it comes to releasing and absorbing energy. So we have different electrons in an atom, and they have different amounts of potential energy. The amount of potential energy in an electron is called its energy level or electron shell. So when electrons absorb energy, they jump to a higher level, just like we see here. So once they absorb energy, they'll jump to the next shell. When they release energy, it's quite the opposite. So instead of jumping to a higher shell, they'll go ahead and fall back to another shell. So my processing piece in blue is also in your notes. It says, what will happen if an electron absorbs a photon? So if an electron absorbs a photon from the sun, is it going to go ahead and absorb, jumping to the highest level, or will it absorb and fall back? The answer is that it will go ahead and jump to a higher shell. So now that we've talked about energy, we're going to go ahead and talk about the bonds and what hold atoms together. In ionic, we have an atom that loses an electron and gains a positive charge, that's a cation, and one atom that gains an electron and a negative charge, which is an anion. This happens between a metal, like the ones in the green section, and a nonmetal, like the ones in the red section. These form ionic compounds, and they are strong bonds. Other types of bonds are covalent. This is where atoms share electrons, and these occur between two nonmetals. These end up forming molecules, and they can be polar or nonpolar. They're very strong bonds. So these molecules are going to go ahead and bond together, and they come from this red section over here. So let's look at an example. Is this an ionic or covalent bond? And what force holds these atoms together? So if I'm looking over here, I can see an electron that is being lost. So I have sodium, that is a metal, and I have chlorine, that is a nonmetal. So is this going to be ionic or covalent? If I'm putting a metal and a nonmetal together, then what will this be? This will be ionic. And here we have our cation that's positive because it lost an electron, and our anion that's negative because it gained an electron. So now that we've talked about this, let's go over what causes covalent bonds to be either polar or nonpolar. So in a nonpolar covalent bond, atoms share electrons equally. But in a polar covalent bond, one atom is more electronegative and electrons aren't shared equally. So in polar molecules, unequal sharing of electrons is going to go ahead and create this partial positive and partial negative charge on different sides. So on your reading quiz, you were asked to say, where would a negative ion be attracted to in water? Well, negatives attract positives, so if you on your quiz put a star in this area or put a star in this area, then you would have received the point. So let's look at water. Is water polar? Ask yourself this. Does it have a partial positive and partial negative? The answer is yes. So therefore, it is a polar molecule. We also have molecules of CO2 and carbon monoxide. We will be going over this in class, so please make sure that you go over this processing piece on your notes. Now that we went over polar and nonpolar, we have different types of forces that attract molecules to each other. The first one is hydrogen bonds. Hydrogen bonds are when you have a hydrogen atom on one molecule that is attracted to an electronegative atom on another. So for example, the hydrogen bond is taking place right here, where the positive part of hydrogen is attracted to a negative, or in other words, electronegative part. This is called the hydrogen bond. Whoops. A second type of force is called dipole-dipole. So this is when you have a partial positive charge on one molecule that is attracted to a partial negative charge on another. Here's another example of dipole-dipole. We have a partial positive charge that is bonded with a partial negative charge. And last but not least, we have London dispersion forces. This is where electrons are temporarily pulled more to one side, creating spots of positive and negative charge, and this is going to create weak attractions between molecules. These are seen in all molecules, even if they're nonpolar, polar, nonpolar. And just to let you know, London dispersion and dipole-dipole forces are sometimes called van der Waals. So let's go ahead and make a prediction. Can you rank these in order from strongest to weakest? I'll go ahead and give you a total of 10 seconds. Go ahead and do that on your notes. Time's up. Let's go ahead and check it out. So in general, not always, this is from strongest to weakest. So the order would be covalent bonds, ionic bonds, hydrogen bonds, and London dispersion. So that's going from strongest to weakest. So now let's go ahead and do some practice. These are actually in your notes. So go ahead and practice identifying what are the types of bonds and what are the types of intermolecular forces. I'll go ahead and let you pause it so you can do this on your notes. And then go ahead and answer, of the bonds or attractions listed above, which two are the strongest and which two are the weakest? I would recommend taking 3 minutes to get this done. When you're ready, go ahead and press play so we can move on. Okay, so let's talk about a really big theme for AP Biology. So what determines molecular shape, and why does it even matter? A molecule shape determines its function, and we're going to see this all over the place in AP Bio. The shape depends on the positions of the bonds and lone pairs. So what shapes does water and CH4 have? So I want you to look at your notes. I'm going to keep this up here so you can look at what your notes have and figure out what shape does it have. So if we come back to our notes, we can say that water is going to go ahead and be bent, whereas methane, CH4, is going to go ahead and be tetrahedral. And this is going to go ahead and determine their function. So how does molecular shape allow for specific binding? Biological molecules bind specifically to other molecules based on their shape, kind of like a key fitting into a lock. Molecules with similar shapes can have similar biological effects. So this blue part is a processing piece. Endorphins, which are feel-good hormones, opium, and morphine, they all have very similar molecular shapes. So as we can see right here, it's very similar. Over here, we can see another very similar one. This is morphine. This is a natural endorphin you might get from jogging. This is morphine, something they might give to patients in a hospital who are under severe pain. So I want you to predict the effects of opium and morphine on the body. So they have similar structure, so they'll have similar function, so they'll have similar biological effects. So endorphins and morphine have similar shapes. They can both bind to receptors that trigger feelings of calm and happiness. And over here, what I want us to do is I want us to go ahead and label the receptors in the cell membrane, and I want you to go ahead and label the binding sites on the molecules. If you're not quite sure where this is, I want you to just take a guess, write it in pencil, and then we're going to be going over our processing pieces in class. So here's some more practice questions. This first practice question says the thyroid gland has receptors for TSH, the tropic hormone that activates it. What would happen if the body produced an antibody that had the same molecular shape as TSH? Can you think of any other examples of specific binding in the body based on molecular shape? So here's a hint, like how do viruses get into cells? How are immune cells activated? How do neurotransmitters work? Remember, I'm going to take us back. If they both can fit into the receptor, they can both trigger the same feelings. So I'm going to go ahead and give you a second to go ahead and answer those practice questions. We will go ahead and review this in class. Now let's do a quick chemistry review in the middle. So my question is, what is the greatest number of bonds an atom can form with other atoms? And assume that these do not have d orbitals. And in order to form the maximum number of bonds, how many valence electrons must the atom have? And number 3, which elements have this many valence electrons? So I want you to go ahead and pause this real quick, see if you can figure this out, and when you're ready, press play. The answer is the greatest number of bonds it can form is 4 bonds, and in order to have the maximum number of bonds, you must have at least 4 valence electrons. And the elements that have this many valence electrons happen to be the carbon family. That's strange. I know that carbon is one of the most important ones for life. So why are organic compounds based on carbon? Because it has 4 valence electrons, so it can form covalent bonds with up to 4 atoms. That's a lot of different things that we can have made for life. So carbon is also small enough to also fit in the center of a molecule. So it's versatile and it allows a huge variety of organic molecules to form around carbon skeletons. So let me ask you this. Can you identify these carbon skeletons in these molecules? I would take a highlighter and go ahead and highlight from here to here. Here's one carbon skeleton. Now let's go to this molecule. Can you find the carbon skeleton? Let's go ahead and highlight from here to here. Now let's look at this third one. I want you to go ahead and highlight from here to here. And also here's another carbon that branches off. Our last molecule, go ahead and highlight starting at this kink. Highlight, 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 highlight. And over here too. But Miss De Leon, I don't remember chemistry that well. Guys, you have to know that if you don't know chemistry, you have to reteach yourself certain concepts, or you're going to have to go to the book and read it once again. In college, it'll happen where you say to yourself, I'm not quite sure if I remember this, but it'll be your responsibility to make sure that you do review yourself so that you're ready for the class. So let's talk about where did organic molecules come from and what are they? So organic compounds contain carbon, hydrogen, and sometimes other atoms. The Urey-Miller experiment demonstrated that organic compounds can form from inorganic compounds present on early Earth. So therefore, our Earth was capable of making these compounds that make life. So now that we've talked about structure and we've talked about function, we're going to go ahead and look into functional groups. So functional groups are groups of atoms that are often involved in reactions, and they give organic molecules distinct chemical properties. So for example, if I'm looking at this female lion, this is something called estradiol, and it's a form of estrogen inside female lions. And then we have testosterone. It's almost completely identical. And you can see, like, over here it looks identical. If I go to the next area of the molecule, it looks identical. If I go to this third part, now it's different because now we have a methyl group right here. And over here, I don't have as many double bonds in this area. but I also have an oxygen that's double bonded instead of a hydroxyl group. So those are the differences that we see, and we can see some of the differences between the lions. So the question for this is, what differences do you notice within the female and the male lion? And do you think the differences within these molecules that cause the lions to be different, do you think these differences are important? Go ahead and write this processing piece. This is something we'll be going over in class. So these are different functional groups that you definitely need to know. This is something that I will be quizzing you on. So we have hydroxyls here. Hydroxyls have an O and an H. They're alcohols, and they're definitely polar. The next ones that we have are carbonyl. We have carbonyl if it's in the middle. If it's on the side, it's considered an aldehyde. So you can think of aldehyde on the side, ketone all alone. Another one that we have is carboxyl group. Carboxyl group is where we have a double bonded oxygen next to a hydroxyl. In college, we used to call it CHOO, C-H-O-O, kind of like a train. Another group that we have are amino. This is going to be pretty important when we start talking about biomolecules. It's a nitrogen with 2 hydrogens. And we also have phosphate. We have phosphate groups that we will definitely see when it comes to ATP, and in fact, that's what we're going to be talking about right now. Our last group that we have are methyl groups, and when we talk about DNA, this is going to be very important. So as you can see, it's just a carbon, and it has 3 hydrogens attached, and it's attached to another molecule. So let's go ahead and talk about ATP, because this little molecule is pretty important, and all of cellular respiration really revolves around making this. So how does ATP store and release energy? So adenosine triphosphate, ATP, is the cell's main energy transferring molecule. When a phosphate is broken off, energy is released. So when we're saying phosphates, let's break this down real quick. These are the phosphates. So triphosphate, we have 1, 2, 3. Adenosine is this right here, and then we have the sugar molecule, ribose, that holds it. Or I'm sorry, pentose. We have a pentose that holds it, which is a 5-carbon sugar. Once we break off one of these phosphates, then we end up with adenosine diphosphate. Di means 2. Energy is used to add a phosphate back to ADP. So for example, for energy releasing reaction, we have ADP plus phosphate plus energy means energy release. Energy using, the same thing. To use our ATP, we're going to go ahead and release energy, and we have to break off a phosphate to go ahead and do that. So let's go ahead and go on to one of the last pages of your notes. So let's talk about what makes a substance hydrophobic and hydrophilic. Water is polar, so it can dissolve other polar substances. Like dissolves like. A hydrophilic dissolves easily in water because it has polar areas. So for example, like salt and glucose. But if you try to mix it with, for example, oil or fat, it wouldn't mix. So hydrophobic substance does not dissolve in water because it's nonpolar. So for example, if you look at a gas station and you see how it looks kind of rainbowy, that's because it's actually floating on top of the water. And so if we're looking at this, this is considered a cell membrane. We have this inner part that is hydrophobic. So it's made out of like oil, fats, and lipids. And then we have the head, so the red parts, that are actually hydrophilic, and they like water. So let's look at this phospholipid, this molecule that makes up the cell membranes. Which part of it is polar and why? And which part of it is nonpolar? So I'm going to give you a tip before we go over it in class. Remember, the polar part has a partial positive and a partial negative. So look for that, and that's going to be your polar part. So we'll be discussing this in class. Let's go ahead and go on to hydrocarbons, since that's what we will be looking at. So what's the structure and function of hydrocarbons? Hydrocarbons contain only carbons and hydrogens. They're nonpolar, so they are hydrophobic. Many biomolecules have hydrocarbon components, especially lipids. So this says circle the hydrocarbons in the triglyceride fat molecule below. Now remember, it's made out of carbons and hydrogens. So you should be circling the carbons and hydrogens. Oh my goodness, Ms. DeLeon, I don't know if I'm going to do this correct. Do it in pencil. This is something we'll be going over in class. So let's talk about what parts are reactants and what parts are products. I remember I told you the story of the sorority girls, the one that just said really pretty all the time. Really pretty. So this part right here, the first part is the reactants. The second part, is going to be the products. So let's talk about chemical equilibrium. Chemical equilibrium is reached when the forward and reverse reaction rates are equal. Can you identify the forward and the reverse reaction in the equation below? The forward will be going to the right, and the reverse reaction will be going to the left. Let's go ahead and cover acids and bases, because we will be seeing this a lot in AP Bio, and so we do need a little bit of a review. So acids are going to go ahead and release the hydronium ions, where bases will go ahead and release the hydroxide ions. These are examples of acids: battery acid, gastric juice, wine, vinegar, coffee. And then if we look at things that are basic are like oven cleaners, or like things that can break down fat, like bleach or household ammonia. And then you also have like milk of magnesia. These are things that help your stomach feel better. Well, actually just milk of magnesia, guys. Don't drink ammonia, don't drink bleach. Okay, let's go ahead and keep going. So we also have buffers, and we'll also be seeing this in AP Bio. Buffers help keep the pH of the solution stable. Most buffers contain molecules that reversibly combine with hydrogen ions. So example, we have the bicarbonate buffer system in blood. Blood contains bicarbonate ion. So if you add an acid, what would happen? So think about what happens if you add this to the equation. What do we end up making more of? If I add more of hydrogen ions, what am I making more of? So if I'm adding more hydrogen ions, so this plus this, what am I making more of? So now that we're done, I want you to go ahead and fill out this exit ticket. Take time to review it. And then that is it for today. Make sure that your summary is done on your notes. If you have any questions, you guys have my number that you can text me at. If you're not one of my students, you can go ahead and leave a comment, and I'll answer as fast as I can. Thank you.